Hello and welcome to India's World. I'm Tracy Shilshi. Now, on November 8th, United States marked exactly 1 year since the unexpected election of Donald Trump as the 45th president of the country. A year on, the country is just as divided as it was on election night. Domestically, he's had a tough year, from the ill-planned travel ban to FBI Director Comey's firing, and then Charlottesville and, of course, the mass shootings. On foreign policy, though, we saw many dramatic decisions and equally hard posturing. To discuss some of those hits and misses by President Trump on that front, we have in studio today Mr. Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, joining us. We have Ms. Meera Shankar, former Ambassador to the US, Mr. KP Fabian, former Diplomat, and also Kiran Stacey, South Asia Correspondent from the Financial Times, joining us from the national capital. Thank you so much to all of you, of course, for joining me here. Firstly, if I could start with you, Mr. Sibal, just let's talk about what were the challenges, at least, and we are talking about on the diplomatic front, on the international front, that Trump faced when he was elected as president, and how do you think he's fared so far? Briefly, if we could talk about.
Well, it's not as if the challenges that Trump faced were different from those faced by the United States over the years and by his predecessor. Whether it's the issue of terrorism or handling the affairs of the Gulf or dealing with Russia or dealing with China.
Yes.
Dealing with East Asia as a whole, and of course NATO and Europe. After all, the United States is a global power. They have a finger in every pie. Trump had no experience in government, no experience in foreign policy, and he has upset a lot of people in the United States by overturning some of the principled elements of US foreign policy. For example, on relationship with NATO, he began by saying NATO was obsolete.
Yes.
With regard to his allies in East Asia, he said, well, let them bear more burden for their own security. He walked out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
yes.
the Trade Pact. He generally said that he is no longer going to be part of any multilateral trade agreement. He wanted to revise NAFTA. He angered the Mexicans by using all sorts of harsh vocabulary against Mexico and his leadership on immigration, on terrorism. He has some very hard posturing. He attacked Islamic terrorism and everything else. And on Russia, he got into huge trouble because there was one sensible element, frankly, in his foreign policy, that was to improve relations with Russia, because there was no sense in what Obama tried to do, is to exclude Russia from any equation and reduce it to a regional power that didn't merit much attention, and pursued a policy of sanctions, which Trump wanted to overturn. But because of all these allegations of Russian interference in US elections and hacking and everything else, the domestic opinion in the Congress and in the mainstream media is so anti-Russian that he has had to walk back. Now, I think the thing that has marked his presidency is firstly the flip-flops. He's very unpredictable. He has said so many things to begin with. He continued to say some of the things, but his actual actions on the ground have been totally different. On China, he began by saying he'll impose 20%, 40% tax on Chinese goods, and railed against US being a victim of unfair trade policies, beginning with China. And now you've seen when he went to China, he wants his personal relationship with Xi Jinping and saying that it's not China's fault. Any other country would have done that.
Okay.
Likewise, on Europe, he has reversed his policies. He has now agreed that NATO continues to be useful, though his individual relations with Germany and other countries are still tense.
All right.
In the Middle East, he's again rocked the boat very surprisingly by supporting Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And this
if
and
I could take that question forward, and we are now going to be going issue by issue, and if we have the time, we'll try to get all of them. But just going to the West Asia crisis at the moment, and now Saudi Lebanon is another thing that's brewing, and we know that he is on the Saudi side. It was quite surprising that he went ahead and even endorsed all the arrests that took place in Saudi, and he kind of, in a sense, said it's justified because the ruler of the country has a right to do what he feels like. How do you see that playing out, and what does it mean for the US when it meddles into business in that manner?
Well, I think the region is already volatile. It probably could become more volatile in future. You see, Obama's foreign policy had at least, made an opening to Iran through the nuclear deal, which was hard fought and hard negotiated, and also included Russia, China and Europe apart from the US. But President Trump has failed to certify that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal. And though he hasn't walked away from it, and at the same time, his policy in this region has tilted very strongly towards Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think it's really a very strongly pro-Israel policy. So it, in a sense, it lacks the balance which would give the US more rather than fewer options in this region. And it exacerbates both Shia, Sunni, Persian, Arab tensions, which have spilled over in Yemen, which have spilled over in Iraq. I think the one success that there has been in this region to some extent is that he has followed a policy of more robust military, supporting more robust military action by allies and other forces supported by the US against ISIS.
Okay.
So in Iraq, there have been very major gains where ISIS has been driven out of most urban centers. And now you see that the Syrian government has also made some very major gains in terms of rolling back and defeating ISIS from urban centers. But US policy on Syria also continues to be confused.
Yes.
Whereas initially Trump said we are not looking so much as at regime change and getting rid of President Assad as at defeating ISIS. That should be our priority. Now there seems to be a little blurring of that message. The whole question of backing rebels against Assad, what they call so-called moderate rebels, is still something which the US is pursuing. So there's still that degree of confusion about the US's Syria policy, though I think the gains that President Assad's forces have made on the ground may force the issue and lead to some kind of tacit acceptance that Assad will not go.
All right.
But overall, I think it is exacerbating tensions within the GCC,
Yes.
the Qatar issue, within Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and between Shias and Sunnis, Persians and Arabs. And you see this spilling over into a lot of theaters of local conflict there.
Absolutely. And talking of conflict, taking on Iran on the nuclear deal, a deal which, it wasn't specifically just US centric. I mean, there were a lot more other countries that were involved in it. And all of them asked the US to relook at its assessment, at least asked Trump to relook at its assessment of what the deal actually involves, what it requires. But, he seemed adamant on, of course, imposing sanctions again. Meanwhile, talking about the NATO, talking about, taking on certain countries where, all this while even the previous administrations have tried to bring in all these countries together and try and work together, whether it is in the form of, the Iran nuclear deal. How is it that Trump is creating this conflict, and how is it going to augur for him as time moves ahead?
Well, to my mind, what we are witnessing is the absence of policy. On the one hand, we have the tweets and whatever President Trump says in public also. On the other hand, we have statements by Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State,
Yes.
and occasionally by the National Security Advisor. So I would say that 25% of US policy, one may say, is determined or is reflected in Trump's tweets, and the 75% is elsewhere. So there is an incoherence.
Yes.
That's the first thing. Second thing is that you mentioned about Iran. Now, Trump has a certain game plan. That is, he was against the nuclear deal, and he wants to probably because of Israel's pushing also, he wants to undo that deal. And one, of course, the aims may be to sell more weapons to that region, because I consider Trump as the most successful salesman for the military industrial complex, or to put it, the congressional military industrial complex. He has sold a lot to Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
He's selling a lot to Qatar, and I'm sure that there are other buyers too, UAE and others. So that is one, this thing. Secondly, there is no coherence. I said he cannot be briefed. He just refuses to be briefed. As Foreign Secretary Sibal said, he had no government experience, but that's not his fault. The question is whether you recognize that you had no government experience.
That's
Are
right.
you prepared to be briefed?
Yes.
If you recall, when George Bush, when he was a candidate, the George Bush Sr., his dad, asked somebody to sort of tutor him in foreign policy, Condi Rice, and she spent a lot of time.
Yes.
And he picked up. So that inability to learn, that he can continue in the same style as a CEO of a real estate company in the White House also, that is most upsetting.
Okay.
And I don't think he has learned it, though there has been some, to an extent only, some taming of the shrew.
A bit of a toning down that we're seeing on certain subjects. Okay, Kiran, Stacey, if I could come to you, one of the policies at least that brought a bit of cheer, at least in India, and gave us something to look forward to, was the South Asia policy. Where India was told to take a larger role in the building up of Afghanistan. Pakistan was named and shamed in a certain, at least to a certain extent, which was seen to be, out of the ordinary of what a US president does. Looking at that, would you call that, in a sense, hard posturing, or do you think that on the ground something may actually work out?
Well, as regards to Pakistan, it's very difficult to tell. As with so much else in his foreign policy, President Trump seems to waver between extremes when it comes to Pakistan. So one moment they're sponsoring terrorism, the next moment he's phoning up the Prime Minister and saying what a wonderful guy he is and what a wonderful country he leads. But I do think one place where there is some coherence to his foreign policy is towards India. I think that the White House has calculated that it definitely wants to strengthen ties with India and strengthen India's position in the region. And that's not just to combat Pakistan, that's also to combat China and its growing regional ambitions. So we see right now in the Philippines at the ASEAN meeting, President Trump has been meeting with his counterparts from Japan, from Australia, and with Prime Minister Modi to try and reconfigure this quad that was a power several years ago but got disbanded because of concerns about what China might make of it. That is actually quite an interesting piece of foreign policy dealing. I don't think it's been steered by Trump, but the fact that he's willing to engage and be part of that, when we know he's not keen on multilateral institutions, probably speaks well for India's position in South Asia and in Asia more broadly.
Absolutely. And talking about Asia, the North Korean issue was one of the bigger challenges, Mr. Sibal. How has he been able to handle it? It's not the first time that US presidents have had to deal with Pyongyang, but this time around it just seemed to go, several steps ahead.
He has his characteristic style of dealing with such issues, and with his tweets and his threats to North Korea, which are not befitting the manner in which they were made,
but it doesn't
the level
help
of
that,
the
it is
US
in
president.
this presidency that, you have an intercontinental ballistic missile too that has been tested. And,
in my view, United States has mishandled the North Korean issue. Now, I accept that the North Korean regime is extremely difficult to handle. But having said that, they have allowed the situation to deteriorate, where at one moment North Korea had actually ceased developing its nuclear program, etc., based on certain conditions and what they might get in return from the United States. Now, whether that bargain was not upheld because of US fault or North Korean fault, I'm not going to that. But the result of that was that they resumed testing, and they resumed missile testing, and then developed more and more powerful missiles, and now are in a position actually to threaten Guam. Now, what does this say about United States as the foremost power in that area, with powerful allies like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and others, that they have allowed the situation to deteriorate? Secondly, I think he's walked into a trap with China.
Okay.
Because he's now banking more and more on China doing something, which has 2-3 consequences. One is that China is going to play games with the United States, just as Pakistan has played games with the United States. They'll cooperate a little bit, keep the hope alive that they'll cooperate more, and then be successful in warding off pressures on points on which they don't want to be submitted to US pressure, as on trade deficit issues.
Yes.
And therefore, United States will be at a loss, as we have seen during his current visit, about how to handle China and its role in North Korea. Secondly, it suits China's strategic interests to maintain pressure on Japan and South Korea and others, and then to be seen as a country which can actually
make a difference, which can
be
actually
appealed to, and then can be a part of the solution.
Yes, and
knowing
in fact,
fully
the
well,
only country that can probably reach out to
knowing
North
fully
Korea.
well that China is not going to abandon North Korea, even though North Korea has become a headache for China to some extent, because on the other side, the advantages it has about the kind of unbalance in the strategic environment that North Korea has created actually is in favor of China's interests, and also takes attention away from all its misconduct in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, because you can't at the one hand seek China's cooperation and then hit them on the South China and other South China Sea and other issues. So I have a feeling that there are no good options available, and at the end of the day, United States has to negotiate in some way or the other with North Korea. They cannot eliminate North Korea's nuclear program, but they have to assure North Korea against regime change. This may not be a messy solution, but this is the only solution, because the cost of any military conflict would be horrible for South Korea and for the region as a whole.
All right. And speaking about China, you know, the TPP, when the US decided to get out of it, to a large extent, it just meant a huge win for China. And now, even at the ASEAN summit, you have the 11 countries saying they are going to go ahead with it, call it something different, but pretty much the outline is going to be that. You know, and that in itself is a big setback to the US.
Well, I think, yes, you know, the Obama administration had announced their policy of a rebalance towards the Asia Pacific. And this policy included both military and security elements, as well as diplomatic elements, as well as economic elements. And the economic element of this was to tie the countries of the region more closely to the United States through this Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. Of course, neither China nor India were part of this agreement. And the agreement had negotiated WTO plus norms, in a sense, which would have forced these countries to eventually either accept those norms or find themselves discriminated against by the US. But the US walking out of it means, and seeking bilateral deals with the countries in the Asia Pacific, you know, raises questions about the credibility of the US commitment to the region.
Absolutely.
And also about whether the US is really, you know, willing to be a counterpoise to China, which is, you know, gradually becoming the economically dominant partner for many of these countries. So if the US wants to, you know, counter, they also have to have an economic policy element. The fact that these 11 countries have chosen to go ahead means, A, that Japan and South Korea are looking at TPP as something which will give them advantage in this region, because China is not a part of it. And B, they're also looking at the future. You know, any future administration in the United States might overturn what President Trump has done and join the partnership But if it collapses and there's nothing,
Yes.
then you have to begin afresh. So
Okay.
in some sense, if you look at these 11 countries, they're betting that at some time in future, the US will join.
All right.
And in the meanwhile, they'll keep it.
All right. Very quickly, talking of commitments, the Paris climate deal as well, that was a big jolt even to the Americans. I mean, although it was said that they had not much to gain from it, but at the same time, the very fact that a US pulls out of it, was a big deal.
It's like this. If President Trump had a plan to diminish the role of the United States globally, if he had a plan, I would say that he has succeeded.
Okay. All right.
And as regards the Paris climate, we also should recognize that the United States of America is divided. While President Trump wants to walk out and has said that he would walk out, there is the rest of America which is certainly for the climate change agreement. They want to do something about it.
Okay. Okay. Kiran, if I could come to you, we're talking about foreign policies, of course, of the Trump administration, but, some of the domestic policies are also something that affects India. When you talk about the H-1B issue, the visas issue, you talk about certain travel restrictions, you talk about as far as the Dreamers program as well. There are some of these which also affect Indians. To that sense, how do you see, the next chapter unfolding for India?
Yeah, that's right. And this is what I was saying about President Trump's wanting India to become more involved in the region. This is where the burgeoning alliance slightly starts to fall apart, because I don't expect President Trump to make concessions on his domestic policy, especially when it comes to visas and immigration. So I don't think that he's willing to give way, for example, on H-1B visas to achieve whatever he wants to in Pakistan, Afghanistan, in the South Asia region with India. I think that if Prime Minister Modi thinks that he can use his new relationship with the US President to be able to get what India wants on those issues, he's going to be very disappointed.
Okay.
President Trump came in really with one big message for the Americans, which was that he was going to make America great again and certainly clamp down on immigration.
All right, all right. And so the next few years, I mean, how is it going to be for India, Mr. Sibal? America great again. India, at least in the first year, seems to be poised in a certain balanced manner. But how do you see it going ahead?
Well, I think our relationship with the United States has improved to such an extent that we are no longer worried about America being great again. In some ways, we won't mind if America becomes great again, if it is willing to take on China, because it is ceding a lot of space to China. In our own region, it's interesting now that Trump has bought the phrase Indo-Pacific, which means that he's moved away from Asia-Pacific, in which China is the dominant factor in Asia, and he's speaking of the Indo-Pacific, where India comes in.
Yes.
And even at the APEC summit, which India is not a member, he devoted a paragraph to India.
That's right.
Which is unusual. And also in terms of what we are doing together in the Indian Ocean and the defense supplies, defense area and this and that, augurs well in terms of our future relationship with the United States. Now let's see if Trump has the political longevity that is now coming into question, because he's highly contested domestically, he's in big trouble.
Okay.
But the outlook for us is all right, despite what was said earlier on H-1B visas and others. Those differences will continue, but the overall relationship has taken a new turn and a positive turn.
Do you agree with that, Ms. Shankar?
Yeah, I think that, this is the direction in which the relationship has been moving for some time.
Yes.
And institutionally within the United States, whether it's the Democrats, whether it's the Republicans, the logic of seeking stronger ties with India in a world in which China's rise is going to be one of the seminal questions of the future, how do you handle it, then I think that this is something which Trump too has embraced.
Yes.
We've seen the defense relationship becoming stronger, because President Obama had declared India a major ally, major partner, and agreed to treat us on par with their closest allies.
Okay.
And President Trump has reaffirmed his commitment to this, has reaffirmed commitment to the, defense trade initiative, DTI, and technology initiative, the convergence with regard to the Asia Pacific is strong, and in Afghanistan I think the new policy is one which I think doesn't give the sense that the US is just walking away from the region. But I think there is dissonance with regard to the economic relationship to some extent, and Trump's domestic agenda on the economic front.
We'll reflect on us a bit. We'll have to wait and see what happens on that front. Thank you so much to all of you for joining me, of course, on this debate. Thank you, Kiran, as well, for joining me. I'm sorry I'm running short of time. You know, like we said, big domestic changes, of course, requiring the Congress there in the US. But with foreign policy, the president has more leeway. And 1 year on, perhaps, be it positive or negative, it's all on Trump. Tell us what you think. Write into us at indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. I'll see you next week.